Somebody said, former chairman of the FCC, this is a Pyrrhic victory. And so I went and Googled King Pyrrhus in Wikipedia. He was a king of Epirus in Greece. He fought the Romans in Italy. He won a battle, but had tremendous casualties, loss of soldiers. And that's what made his victory Pyrrhic. But, well, this is a catchy quote. I don't think the victory, it's a Pyrrhic victory for the gatekeepers. Here, the gatekeepers may have won on the front of the specific rules, but they lost on the much more important front of whether the FCC can do something about net neutrality. So I would not call it a Pyrrhic victory for the gatekeepers. I would call it a defeat for them and a victory for the FCC.
I believe the FCC did not have the legal authority to do what it did, and in part, and actually in large part, the court agreed. The FCC tried to impose rules that resembled those rules that were created for phone monopolies, the Ma Bell monopoly back in 1934, which actually had its roots in 19th century railroad monopoly legislation, which had its roots in 17th century canal regulation, and so on. And that was what's called the non-discrimination requirement. Back to that word, discrimination. So that was actually what content application providers were looking for, was for the economic regulation of ISPs and the cost shifting that would come along with that. And that's what didn't happen. What did happen was, for the first time, the court found that under this section that you probably never heard of before, Section 706, which was written in 1996 by Congress and signed into law by President Bill Clinton, that somehow this section gave the FCC the authority to regulate in this space. And it gave the authority, the way the court fashioned it, the way the court legislated, in a way that was fairly expansive, but also limited. It was expansive in its reach in terms of how far it could go, a mile wide, but an inch deep. It couldn't look like common carriage regulation or the regulation of phone monopolies. We also call that in the shorthand, in case I lapse into shorthand here with broadcasters, Title II. You're not regulated under Title II, broadcasters, you're regulated under Title III, by the way. So Title II are the phone monopoly regulations. Now, I disagree with what the court ruled, but the court ruled 2-1. That part of the decision was 2-1. I agree very closely with the Judge Silberman dissent in that case. I think he was right on. I think had he drawn a different panel, the decision would have come out a different way. And I think in the future, if there are a different panel of judges to look at this, the decision could come out in a different way. It could be actually overturned.
In 2002, I took Tim Wu's internet law class at the University of Virginia Law School when he was writing the paper that would give birth to the term net neutrality. And while I love Tim and consider him to have been one of the best teachers I had in law school, I blame him for our wasting much of the time that has been spent debating tech policy over the last 12 years on debating what is essentially an empty abstraction that has been incredibly politically useful for people who want to draw political lines and to say we either have net neutrality or we don't have net neutrality, and you're either with us or you're against us. But there's really no there. So the concerns that Jessica, or let me put it this way, there are a set of concerns there, but they're specific problems that I think are not easily reduced to net neutrality. There are specific problems about competition, potential discrimination, broadband deployment, broadband competition. They're all problems that we should be talking about and that we could actually have a constructive conversation about. And we end up not actually talking about because everybody wants to talk about this abstraction. We all regulate all of these markets. That's what the antitrust laws do. That's what the Federal Trade Commission does. The question fundamentally is how you regulate. And in a nutshell, my argument is, and always has been, that we should first and foremost do everything we can to get out of the way of competition. And this inquiry that the FCC has opened is apparently going to look into that a little bit, although Chairman Wheeler seems to think that the only problem is that local governments can't spend money on building government-run networks instead of funding their teachers' pensions or making it easier for private companies to deploy broadband. But we should, number one, do that. And number two, we should have a conversation around how do we regulate broadband. If the antitrust laws aren't enough, as essentially everybody who's been arguing for net neutrality says, well, what is the right way to do it?
But let's look at an example, taking the Flying Squirrel channel. So I am a subscriber, I'm a broadband access subscriber, and I pay my broadband access provider, whether the cable company or the telephone company, let's say $50 a month for broadband access. And by the way, there's a lot of commentary to the effect that this $50 a month or $90 a month, depending on advertised speeds, may give that company something as much as a 97% gross margin. And then, and here we come to double charging, the company turns to the flying squirrel channel and says, you flying squirrel channel need to give me another $20. So if I am a flying squirrel fanatic, I'm paying the $90 in order to have access and high definition access, no revolving circles, no down resolution, to pictures of flying squirrels. And so that's why I said that the free markets and free market theory have never been interpreted to include a proposition that says you can double charge for the same thing, because that's what the company would be doing.
Number one, the claim that cable has a 97% profit margin is wildly untrue. If you actually look at an accounting measure that takes into account the cost of capital, their profit margin is considerably lower than internet companies, something on the order of 5%. And I raise this because that myth helps to demonstrate some of the hysteria around this issue, this sense that cable is this evil, rapacious monopolist that must be screwing Americans is just not true. In fact, they've invested $300 billion into building out networks that are now facing competition from fiber and from increasingly fast new generations of DSL service that offer 45 and 75 megabit per second speeds.
And they're losing customers. 6.7 million customers since 2009 they've lost.
And indeed, but more generally, the point is that in this respect, in terms of numbers and accounting, this debate has been largely divorced from reality. And in a second respect, this entire argument rests on this premise that they're just waiting to flip the switch. I mean, for example, Jessica, and she's pointed this out before, notes that Verizon at oral arguments said, well, yes, but for these rules, we might act differently. Well, that doesn't mean that they were waiting to flip the switch and start blocking companies. What they said was, we have editorial rights to run our networks under the First Amendment. We are defending them in court. And we have the right to do something like, for example, AT&T's sponsored data program, which is a program where in the wireless space, you could have a provider like ESPN could say, I want to pay for customers' data so that it's not counted against their caps. That's the sort of thing that could actually be great for broadcasters and video generators who want to encourage mobile viewing.